Does anyone else think that it's odd that the Mass that we're celebrating right now is called the Mass of the Lord's Supper, yet no one in the Gospel is eating? And odder still is that this is the Mass where we celebrate not only the institution of the Eucharist, but the institution of the priesthood as well. Yet not one word is mentioned about either. God's ways are not our ways. Instead, what we have in tonight's Gospel is the ultimate example of the disposition that all of us should have towards these sacraments. A profound, selfless humility. Now there's a word that doesn't sit well in our world today. To be humble is to be weak by the world's standards. To be fawning, inferior, sheepish. And that's not us. We're bold, independent, and masters of our own destinies. We have ambitions, lofty desires. We dream big dreams. We aspire to greatness, and by God, we get what we want. So what kind of Messiah is this anyway? What kind of kingdom could this guy possibly have to offer? Didn't he know that by law, no master could force any slave to do something so low as to wash his feet? Judas knew it. He knew it well because he was a man of his time. And no kind of king would ever stoop so low as to wash the dusty filth of Palestine off the smelly, calloused feet of his own subjects. God's ways are not our ways. John goes into minute detail to describe every action that Jesus performs during the washing of the feet. There are 7 of them. He rises. He lays his garments aside. He takes a towel. He ties it around his waist. He pours the water. He washes the feet. And he dries them with a towel. You know, it's almost as if he's summarizing his own incarnation. He rises from his heavenly union with the Father. He lays aside the garments of his glory. He wraps about his divinity the towel of human nature. He pours himself out on the cross of redemption. He washes the souls of his disciples and followers clean, and then wipes the old covenant away with the new one. As Paul says in the 2nd chapter of Philippians, Jesus, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God something to be grasped. Rather, he emptied himself and took the form of a slave. Jesus performed this act of ultimate humility, a task that was beneath even the lowest slave. Because, as John says, he was fully aware that the Father had put everything into his power. Everything was put into his power. And yet he still goes and does this. God's ways are not our ways. Now try to imagine the disciples sitting there stock still, lost in mute astonishment as the anointed one of God bends down to cleanse them of their foulness, making it obvious that it will only be through humility that we will ever reach God. But But there were two characters there that night to whom it wasn't all that obvious. First was Peter, who said, "You will never wash my feet." You see, Peter had a problem with the humiliation that the cross demanded. At Caesarea Philippi, when Jesus told him he was to go to Jerusalem and to be crucified, Peter protested vehemently. He had rebuked the cross then, and he rebuked the humility that would lead to the cross. He thought that glory could be achieved without sacrifice, without trial, without suffering. Sometimes we do too. God's ways are not our ways. Now, the second character who didn't get it, obviously, was Judas, the man of his time. Like most Palestinian Jews of his day, he wanted a Messiah that was a conquering hero, that would oust the Roman occupiers and set up this kick-butt kingdom that would restore Israel to its glory days. A kingdom nobody would mess with. And he, Judas Iscariot, would be one of its overlords. But day by day he was watching the promise of power slip away. And this show of subservience tonight was just the icing on the cake of his dashed dreams. What was worse, Jesus expected them to behave that way too. God's ways are not our ways. These two men who stood in such stark contrast to each other in so many ways were actually two sides of the same coin of flawed human nature, like us. Sometimes we can be like Peter, who was repulsed by the scandal of the cross, who during the course of this meal declared to Jesus, "I will lay down my life for you," yet denied him 3 times just a few hours later. We're like him whenever our faith is fueled by the emptiness of false bravado and pride. And sometimes we're like Judas, who sought a temporal power to overthrow enemies, who was bitterly disappointed that the Son of God was not a made-to-order Messiah. We're like him whenever our faith is refashioned into our own image and likeness. You see, it's not the love of power that brings glory, but the power of love. God's ways are not our ways. Yet both of these men were consecrated as priests this night and commissioned with a simple mandate. Love one another as I love you. So simple. It's so hard to do for them and for us. Because so often we try to do it without Him, who is the author of love.